Jordan Peterson's fingers stopped mid-air, frozen in the deliberate gesture he always used when making a precise intellectual point. His eyes, normally sharp with the confidence of a man who had dismantled countless arguments on stages across the world, suddenly widened with something that looked disturbingly close to shock. Across from him, Jonathan Roumie sat with an unsettling calm, his hands folded gently in his lap, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Dr. Peterson, Jonathan's voice carried that same gentle authority viewers had come to know from his portrayal of Jesus. You asked me if I truly believe in the literal resurrection. Let me tell you what happened 3 nights ago that made even my own rational mind unable to deny what I've been portraying. The studio audience leaned forward as one. Peterson's jaw tightened, his trademark intensity wavering. He had come into this interview ready to engage Jonathan in rigorous philosophical discussion, expecting polite deferrals to mystery or emotional appeals to faith. What he had not expected was this. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, and the cross around his neck caught the studio lights. I was alone in my apartment, preparing for a scene we're filming next week. The resurrection scene. He paused, letting the weight settle. And something happened that I cannot explain with psychology, Dr. Peterson. Something that made every intellectual framework I've ever used completely inadequate. Peterson's hands slowly lowered to grip the armrests of his chair, knuckles going slightly white. A bead of perspiration formed at his temple despite the cool studio temperature. He opened his mouth to respond, but Jonathan wasn't finished. You've spent years explaining the psychological significance of the resurrection story. You've called it the most profound archetypal narrative in human history. And you're right. But have you ever asked yourself why? The question hung in the air like a physical presence, and for perhaps the first time in his celebrated career, Jordan Peterson appeared genuinely uncertain. His mouth opened, then closed. His eyes searched Jonathan's face as if looking for a trap. Jonathan's expression softened with compassion. What I experienced 3 nights ago wasn't just emotion. It wasn't archetypal resonance or psychological projection. It was something that made me understand why you cry when you talk about these stories, even while you're trying to explain them away as mythology. Peterson's face went pale. His breathing became shallow, visible in the slight rise and fall of his shoulders. A woman in the audience gasped softly, immediately covering her mouth. You asked me if I literally believe, Jonathan continued, voice gaining strength. Let me answer with something you said yourself. You said the most real things are the things we cannot see. Truth, beauty, justice, love. More real than the chair you're sitting on because they persist beyond material decay. Peterson's throat bobbed visibly as he swallowed hard. So here's my answer, Jonathan said, and the studio held its breath. What if the resurrection is the most real thing that ever happened precisely because it transcends the merely physical? What if it's so psychologically powerful because it actually occurred, and our souls recognize that truth even when our minds try to reduce it to metaphor? The silence was absolute. Peterson's entire body went still, frozen by the implications. When he finally spoke, his voice came out rough, barely recognizable. Jonathan, he whispered, what exactly happened to you 3 nights ago? Jonathan's slight smile deepened, and he settled back in his chair. Let me tell you about the moment I stopped being able to separate the actor from the truth he was portraying. The interview had begun 30 minutes earlier with all the energy of a typical intellectual exchange. The host, Rebecca Chin from PBS, had introduced both men with genuine enthusiasm, knowing her audience would be fascinated by this unlikely pairing. Today we have Dr. Jordan Peterson, clinical psychologist, professor, and one of the world's leading public intellectuals, she had announced to warm applause. And Jonathan Roumie, the actor bringing Jesus Christ to life in the groundbreaking series The Chosen, watched by over 500 million people worldwide. The studio audience had applauded thunderously, a mix of Peterson's devoted followers who'd read his books and analyzed his lectures, and faithful viewers of The Chosen who saw Jonathan not just as an actor, but as a conduit to something sacred. Peterson had arrived that morning with his usual meticulous preparation. He'd spent the previous evening reviewing episodes of The Chosen, making notes in the margins of printed transcripts, identifying the theological assumptions embedded in the show's narrative choices. This was what he did. He found the patterns, exposed the archetypes, revealed the psychological truths hidden beneath religious language. He'd done it with the Bible itself in his biblical lectures, drawing millions of viewers by explaining scripture through the lens of evolutionary psychology and Jungian analysis. Jonathan Roumie would be interesting, he'd thought, an actor who had become so identified with his role that perhaps he'd lost the ability to distinguish performance from reality. It would make for compelling television, a gentle but firm reminder that even our most sacred stories operate first and foremost as psychological truths. But something had felt different the moment Peterson shook Jonathan's hand in the green room. There was an intensity in the actor's eyes, yes, but it wasn't the intensity of someone lost in a role. It was the intensity of someone who had seen something, experienced something, and was waiting patiently for the right moment to share it. Peterson had felt an unfamiliar flutter of uncertainty in his chest, quickly dismissed as pre-interview adrenaline. Jonathan, for his part, had been praying since dawn. Not the quick, hurried prayers of someone asking for success, but the deep, contemplative prayer of someone preparing to speak truth to a brilliant mind that had built elaborate defenses against that very truth. He had tremendous respect for Peterson. He'd read 12 Rules for Life and Maps of Meaning, had watched hours of his lectures, and had found himself moved by Peterson's obvious hunger for meaning, even as the professor stopped just short of the leap that hunger pointed toward. The conversation had flowed naturally at first, covering familiar territory. Peterson had asked about Jonathan's preparation for the role, expecting stories about method acting and character research. Jonathan had described his daily routine with genuine openness. "I begin every day with an hour of silent prayer, Dr. Peterson. Not reciting memorized words, but sitting in the presence of what I believe to be the living God." Peterson had nodded, his analytical mind already translating. Meditative practice, psychological centering, tapping into archetypal energies. "Then I read scripture, but also the church fathers, the early Christian mystics, and yes," Jonathan had smiled slightly, "I read Jung too. And Dostoevsky. And you." That had surprised Peterson, visible in the slight raise of his eyebrows. "You've read my work?" Jonathan's smile had deepened. "Of course. Maps of Meaning is brilliant, Dr. Peterson. Your analysis of how stories shape our perception of reality is profound. I just think you stop your analysis one step too soon." Peterson had leaned forward at that, intrigued despite himself. "What do you mean?" And that's when Jonathan had shifted in his seat, his expression becoming more serious, and said the words that would change the entire trajectory of their conversation. "You treat the resurrection as the ultimate archetypal story of death and rebirth. But you never ask the obvious question, why does this particular story have more psychological power than any other death and rebirth narrative in human history? Why does it work on the human soul in a way that Osiris, Dionysus, and every other dying and rising god simply doesn't?" Peterson had opened his mouth to respond with his standard explanation about the unique historical context of Christianity, its fusion of Greek philosophy and Hebrew monotheism, the singular moral innovation of the crucified God. But Jonathan had held up a gentle hand. "Before you answer, let me tell you what happened to me 3 nights ago." And that's when the atmosphere in the studio had shifted, when Peterson's confident expression had begun to crack, when the intellectual chess match he'd expected transformed into something far more unsettling. The host had sensed the change, her years of experience telling her to let Jonathan speak, to let this moment unfold naturally. The cameras had captured Peterson's face as it moved from curiosity to attention to something approaching concern. Jonathan had taken a slow breath, his hands still folded calmly in his lap, and began to describe an experience that would shake one of the world's most formidable intellects to his core. "I was alone, as I said, preparing for our filming of the resurrection scene. We've been building toward it for seasons, and I wanted to understand it, not just as narrative, but as reality." Peterson's eyes had narrowed slightly, his analytical mind preparing to categorize what was coming. Emotional experience, psychological projection, the actor losing himself in the role. But what Jonathan said next had stopped that analytical process cold. Dr. Peterson, you've talked about how the most profound truths often come to us unbidden, how we can't think our way into them. You were right. What visited me that night wasn't something I conjured or imagined. He paused, and in that pause, Peterson's hands had begun to tremble almost imperceptibly. It was something that found me. Peterson's hands gripped the armrest tighter as he tried to regain his intellectual footing. "Jonathan," he said, his voice carrying that precise, measured tone, "I need to stop you here. What you're describing sounds like a profound psychological experience, perhaps even a transpersonal event in the Jungian sense. But surely you understand the difference between a powerful internal experience and an external ontological reality." It was the challenge he'd been building toward, the careful intellectual corner he was known for backing people into. When you say something found you, you're speaking metaphorically about an aspect of your own psyche, aren't you? Jonathan didn't flinch. Instead, his expression remained serene, almost expectant. "That's what I would have said too, Dr. Peterson. 6 months ago, I would have agreed with you completely." He leaned forward, something in his eyes making Peterson's confident expression waver. "But let me ask you something first. In your lectures on the Bible, I've watched you weep. Real tears. When you discuss Abraham and Isaac, when you talk about Christ's sacrifice, you cry in front of thousands of people. You've said yourself that you don't fully understand why." The observation landed with unexpected force. Peterson's jaw tightened, a slight flush creeping up his neck. "Those tears," Jonathan continued gently, "you've explained them as a response to archetypal truths. But Dr. Peterson, what if your tears know something your intellect refuses to acknowledge?" The question hung in the air. Peterson looked genuinely uncertain, caught between his analytical framework and something deeper. Jonathan pressed forward with calm insistence. "You cry because some part of you recognizes these aren't just stories. Some part of you knows the sacrifice was real, that the resurrection was real. And it terrifies you to admit that because it would mean restructuring everything you've built your career upon." The studio went completely silent. Peterson's breathing became audibly heavier, his hands pressing against his temples in that gesture he made when processing something challenging. "You're saying my emotional responses are more truthful than my intellectual analysis?" His voice carried defensiveness and genuine curiosity. Jonathan shook his head slightly. "No, Dr. Peterson. I'm saying your intellectual analysis is incomplete because it stops where your fear begins." The words were compassionate but landed hard. Peterson's face flushed, his eyes brightening with what might have been tears. "You've spent decades explaining why these stories matter psychologically, but you've never allowed yourself to consider that they might matter psychologically because they're actually true." Peterson's response came out hoarse. "But Jonathan, you're asking me to abandon the very methodology that's given meaning to thousands of people. I've helped people trapped between fundamentalism and nihilistic atheism. The psychological approach creates space for meaning without requiring acceptance of claims that seem to violate everything we know." There was genuine passion in his voice, a man defending a life's work. "I know," Jonathan said quietly. "And that work has been beautiful. But what if the next step is to stop seeing literal truth and psychological truth as opposites? You've said yourself that consciousness is fundamental, that meaning is built into existence. So why is it such a leap to believe that God might also act within reality in concrete, historical ways?" Peterson sat back heavily, his face a mixture of resistance and recognition. His eyes were bright now, definitely holding back tears. "Because," he said slowly, each word costing him something, "if the resurrection actually happened, if it's literally, historically, physically true, then..." He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Jonathan finished it for him, gentle but unwavering. "Then you have to decide what you're going to do about it. You can't just analyze it anymore, Dr. Peterson. You have to respond to it. And that's terrifying." Peterson's hands shook visibly. The host sat frozen, her prepared questions forgotten. "Let me tell you what happened 3 nights ago," Jonathan said, his voice taking on a sacred quality. "And then you can decide for yourself whether what I experienced was just my psyche, or whether it was something that broke into my reality from outside it." Peterson nodded slowly, his analytical defenses temporarily suspended, his brilliant mind finally willing to consider that perhaps his framework was missing something essential. "I'm listening," he whispered, and in those two words was the sound of a fortress beginning to crack. Jonathan's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing everyone in the studio to lean forward. "3 nights ago, I was in my apartment at 2 a.m., unable to sleep. We're filming the resurrection scene next week, and I felt completely unprepared. Not as an actor, I knew my lines. But something deeper was unsettled." His hands unfolded, gesturing slowly. "I'd been playing Jesus for years. I thought I understood the role, the man, the message. But the resurrection? That felt like the moment where everything either proved true or fell apart as beautiful mythology." Peterson leaned forward despite himself, his defensive posture softened. Jonathan continued, his voice steady but carrying awe mixed with fear. "I got on my knees in my living room and said out loud, 'If you're real, if the resurrection actually happened, I need to know.' Not as an actor preparing for a scene, but as a man who's been portraying you without fully believing." Several audience members gasped softly. Here was the actor who'd brought Jesus to life for millions, confessing his own doubt. And then, Peterson's voice came out hoarse, barely recognizable. His legendary fluidity reduced to those 2 words. Jonathan's eyes brightened with something that looked like the memory of overwhelming light. "The room got cold, Dr. Peterson. Not naturally cold, but the kind that makes you feel reality itself has shifted. And I heard, not with my ears, but with something deeper, a voice that said, 'You want to know if I rose from the dead? Then experience what death actually is.'" The studio sat in absolute silence. Peterson's face went pale, his throat working as he swallowed hard. "What happened next, I can't fully explain," Jonathan said, his voice shaking slightly. "It felt like everything that made me me was being stripped away. Every identity, every accomplishment, every relationship, gone. Not dying physically, but experiencing complete annihilation of self." His hands gripped the chair arms, knuckles white. "I don't know how long it lasted. Could have been seconds, could have been hours. But in that void, that absolute nothingness, I understood that death is not just biological cessation. It's the complete unraveling of meaning itself." Peterson's mouth fell open, his breathing shallow. And then, Jonathan's expression transformed, a radiant smile breaking across his face. "And then light, Dr. Peterson. Not metaphorical light. Light that had personality, that had love, that had purpose. And in that light, I wasn't just alive again. I was more alive than I'd ever been. Every part of me that had been annihilated was restored, but better, fuller, more real." His voice grew stronger. "And I heard that voice again. This is what I did. Not as metaphor. Not as archetype. I went into actual death and brought actual life back out of it." Peterson's hands gripped his own knees, his whole body leaning forward. "How long did this experience last?" Jonathan checked his reality. "When I finally looked at my phone, 4 hours had passed. But it felt both like a moment and like eternity." The host found her trembling voice. "Jonathan, are you saying you had a mystical experience, or are you claiming something more?" Jonathan turned to her, serious. "I'm saying I experienced the resurrection not as idea or metaphor, but as reality I was allowed to touch. When I came out of it, I was ontologically different." He looked back at Peterson. "You asked if I believe in the literal resurrection. Dr. Peterson, after that night, I don't believe it. I know it." Peterson's face showed longing now. "But how do you know this wasn't a profound psychological event brought on by your immersion in the role?" It was his last defensive rampart, and even as he said it, his voice carried desperation, as if hoping Jonathan would convince him. Jonathan leaned back, patient and understanding. "Because I came back different in ways I couldn't have manufactured. The next morning, I called our director. He said something that made my blood run cold. He paused, the tension electric. He said, 'Jonathan, at 2 a.m. last night, I woke up with an overwhelming urge to pray for you. I felt like you were walking through death itself. I prayed for 3 hours until I felt peace. Peterson's eyes widened in shock. He had the same experience? At the same time? Jonathan nodded slowly. He had no way of knowing what I was going through. We hadn't talked in days. But somehow he knew. He felt it. The implications hung in the air like thunder. Peterson's hands shook, not from anxiety but from something else entirely. That's impossible to explain through standard psychological models. Jonathan's smile was gentle but firm. Exactly, Dr. Peterson. Which means either we expand our models to include realities we've been afraid to acknowledge, or we keep explaining away experiences that are trying to tell us something true. And with those words, Peterson's last defensive walls began to crumble. Peterson's hands slowly released his knees and came up to cover his face. For a long moment, he sat there in silence, his shoulders rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. When his hands finally lowered, his eyes were red-rimmed and glistening with unshed tears. "Jonathan," he said, his voice breaking on the name, "I have to tell you something I've never said publicly." The studio seemed to hold its collective breath. Even the crew stopped their subtle movements, sensing they were about to witness something historic. Peterson's legendary composure had completely dissolved, replaced by raw vulnerability that was almost painful to watch. "For years," Peterson continued, his words coming slowly as if each one cost him something, "I've had dreams. Recurring dreams where I'm standing before the cross, and I know, not think, not theorize, but know, that it's real. That it happened. That he actually died and actually rose." His voice cracked completely on the last word, and tears began streaming down his face unchecked. "And I wake up terrified not because I don't believe it, but because I do. And if I admit that publicly, if I say the words, 'I believe Jesus literally rose from the dead,' then everything changes. My academic credibility, my role as a bridge between faith and reason, my ability to speak to secular audiences, all of it potentially gone." Jonathan's expression radiated compassion as he watched Peterson's confession. The audience sat in stunned silence, many with tears streaming down their own faces, witnessing one of the world's most formidable intellects admitting to a fear that had shaped decades of his public life. Rebecca Chen had given up any pretense of hosting, her hand over her mouth, tears flowing freely. Peterson wiped his face roughly with his hand, but the tears kept coming. "You said something earlier that struck me like a hammer," he continued, looking directly at Jonathan. "You said my analysis stops where my fear begins. You're right. I've been afraid. Afraid that taking that final step would mean abandoning reason, becoming intellectually dishonest, betraying everything I've built." Jonathan leaned forward, his voice gentle but carrying absolute conviction. "Dr. Peterson, do you remember what you said in your biblical lectures about Abraham? You said that sometimes you have to sacrifice what you love most to discover what's most real." Peterson nodded, unable to speak. "What if what you need to sacrifice isn't your intellect, but your fear of what your intellect is actually showing you?" The words landed with precision, and Peterson's face contorted with emotion. "Your tears when you discuss Christ aren't weakness, Dr. Peterson. They're your soul recognizing truth before your mind is brave enough to accept it. Your dreams aren't psychological projection. They're invitations you keep refusing out of fear." Peterson's hands were shaking violently now as he gripped the arms of his chair. "But what if I'm wrong?" His voice came out as almost a whisper, the question of a frightened man rather than a confident professor. "What if I take that step and discover I've deluded myself? What if all the people who trust my analysis feel betrayed?" Jonathan's response was immediate and firm. "Dr. Peterson, you've spent your entire career telling people to tell the truth, to speak what they believe to be real regardless of consequences. You've said that's the only way to live with integrity. So let me ask you directly, do you believe Jesus Christ literally rose from the dead?" The question hung in the air like a sword. The entire studio seemed suspended in time, waiting for Peterson's answer. His mouth opened and closed several times, his brilliant mind clearly racing through implications and consequences. His face cycled through expressions, fear, resistance, longing, and finally, something that looked like surrender. He started, his voice barely audible, then stopped. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and when he opened them again, they were clearer, more focused. "Yes," he whispered. Then louder, voice gaining strength even as it shook with emotion. "Yes. God help me, yes, I do." The studio erupted. Not with applause, but with something deeper, audible gasps, sobs, and whispered prayers. Peterson's face was streaming with tears, but there was something different in his expression now. The tension that had been visible in his jaw and shoulders for the entire interview had released. He looked simultaneously exhausted and liberated, like a man who'd been carrying an impossible weight and had finally set it down. Jonathan's own eyes filled with tears as he reached across the space between their chairs and gripped Peterson's shoulder. "Welcome home, brother," he said simply, and Peterson let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "I don't know what this means," Peterson said, his voice still shaking but carrying a note of wonder now. "I don't know how to integrate this into everything I've taught, everything I've written. I don't know how my audience will respond." Jonathan's smile was radiant. "You don't have to know, Dr. Peterson. You just had to tell the truth. Everything else will follow from that." Peterson nodded slowly, wiping his face again, and for the first time since the interview began, he smiled, not the confident, analytical smile of the professor, but something more vulnerable and real. "I've been such a coward," he said quietly. "Not about most things, but about this. The most important thing." Rebecca Chen finally found her voice, though it was thick with emotion. "Dr. Peterson, do you understand what you just did? What you just admitted on camera?" Peterson looked at her and laughed, a genuine laugh that carried both terror and joy. "I think I just ended one life and started another," he said. "And the terrifying part is that it feels more like waking up than dying." Jonathan squeezed his shoulder once more before releasing it. "That's because it is, Dr. Peterson. That's exactly what it is. You just experienced your own small resurrection, dying to fear, rising to truth. Welcome to the other side of the analysis. Welcome to the reality you've been circling for years." The atmosphere in the studio had transformed completely. What had begun as an intellectual debate had become something closer to a sacred encounter, and everyone present felt it. Peterson sat back in his chair, his face still wet with tears but his expression peaceful in a way that seemed almost foreign on features so often marked by intense concentration. He looked at Jonathan with something approaching wonder. "You know what's remarkable?" he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "I feel like I should be terrified right now. My career, my reputation, everything could change because of what I just said. But instead I feel..." He paused, searching for the word, "free." Actually free for the first time in years. Jonathan nodded, his own expression reflecting deep understanding. "That's what truth does, Dr. Peterson. Jesus said it himself, the truth will set you free. Not comfort you, not necessarily make life easier, but free you." He leaned back, his posture relaxed but his eyes still intense. "You've been imprisoned by your own brilliance, by your need to have everything fit into a framework that your intellect could control. But some realities are too big for frameworks. They don't fit into our categories, they explode them and invite us into something larger." Peterson was nodding slowly, his analytical mind already beginning to process his experience even as he was still living it. "I've spent decades telling people that meaning is found at the boundary between order and chaos," he said. "But I was trying to stay safely in the realm of analysis, studying the boundary without actually crossing it." Rebecca Chen, sensing the profound shift, asked gently, "Dr. Peterson, what do you think this means for your work going forward? For the millions who follow your teachings?" Peterson took a long breath, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But I think perhaps my previous work wasn't wrong, it was incomplete. I was describing the map without acknowledging the territory. Maybe now I can help people see that the psychological truths I've been teaching point to something even more fundamental." His voice grew stronger as he spoke, as if he was discovering his path even as he articulated it. "Perhaps my calling is to show that faith and reason aren't enemies, that believing in the literal resurrection doesn't mean abandoning intellectual integrity." Jonathan's face lit up with genuine excitement. "That's exactly right, Dr. Peterson. You don't have to choose between your intellect and your faith. God gave you that brilliant mind. He doesn't want you to shut it off. He wants you to use it in service of truth rather than as a defense against it. The insight seemed to energize Peterson, his posture straightening as some of his characteristic intensity returned, but now directed toward a different purpose. All those tears in my lectures, he said, almost talking to himself, I kept explaining them as my response to archetypal depth. But they were my soul weeping because it recognized something my mind refused to acknowledge. My emotions were more honest than my intellect. The host looked between both men, shaking her head in amazement. Gentlemen, I have to say, I've been hosting interviews for 20 years, and I've never witnessed anything like this. Jonathan, you came here expecting to discuss your role in The Chosen. Instead, we've just watched a live conversion experience. Her words brought the weight of the moment into sharp focus. Several audience members were still crying, others sat in stunned silence, and the crew members were exchanging glances that said they knew they just captured something extraordinary. Peterson laughed again, that same mixture of terror and joy. A conversion? Is that what this is? I thought conversions happened in churches or at revivals, not on PBS interview shows. Jonathan smiled warmly. Conversions happen wherever truth breaks through, Dr. Peterson. Sometimes that's in a church, sometimes it's alone in an apartment at 2 a.m., and sometimes it's on camera in front of millions of people. God meets us where we are. His words carried a gentle authority that made them land as comfort rather than judgment. Peterson nodded, then looked directly into the camera, seeming to address his audience directly for the first time. If you're watching this and you're confused or concerned about what you just heard, I understand. I'm confused too. But I'm also more certain of this one thing than I've been of anything in my life. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, I can't keep pretending I don't believe something I know to be true. The raw honesty in his voice was compelling, and social media would later explode with responses from his followers, some celebrating, some concerned, but all recognizing they'd witnessed something genuine. Jonathan reached over and shook Peterson's hand firmly. You know what gives me the most hope about this conversation? He said. It's that you didn't arrive at this through manipulation or emotional pressure. You arrived here through your own intellectual honesty, through following the evidence where it actually leads. That's the strongest kind of faith, the kind that comes not despite reason but because of it. Peterson gripped his hand tightly, his eyes bright. Thank you, Jonathan. For your courage in sharing your experience, for not letting me hide behind my frameworks, and for showing me that there's a way forward that doesn't require me to become intellectually dishonest. Rebecca Chen looked at her watch, realized they'd gone nearly an hour over their scheduled time, and decided she didn't care. Before we close, I need to ask both of you, what do you hope people take away from this conversation? Jonathan answered first, his voice carrying that gentle authority. I hope people see that seeking truth wherever it leads is always worth it, even when it's terrifying. And I hope they understand that God isn't afraid of our questions, our doubts, or our intellectual struggles. He's patient with our journey toward Him. Peterson added, his voice still emotional but growing steadier, and I hope people see that you can be intellectually rigorous and still believe in miracles. That faith isn't the enemy of thought, it's the completion of it. In the weeks following the interview, the internet exploded. Peterson's admission became one of the most watched moments in religious broadcasting history, with clips circulating across every platform. But what surprised everyone was that responses didn't fall into expected categories. Secular intellectuals who'd followed Peterson for years found themselves confronting questions they'd long avoided. Christians who'd been suspicious of his approach suddenly saw him as a bridge. And millions caught between faith and reason watched the interview repeatedly, tears streaming, witnessing someone they respected taking the leap they'd been too afraid to take. Peterson retreated from public life for 2 weeks, spending time in prayer and reflection in ways he'd never allowed himself. When he finally released a statement, it carried a different weight. I've spent my career analyzing what it means to live truthfully. I can no longer analyze from the outside what demands to be lived from the inside. The resurrection is not a theory to be examined but a reality to be encountered. The statement was shared millions of times, sparking conversations in universities, churches, and coffee shops worldwide about faith and intellectual honesty. Jonathan continued filming The Chosen, but his portrayal of Jesus carried even deeper authority now, informed by having witnessed truth break through one of the most formidable intellectual defenses of the modern age. Dr. Peterson's courage has opened doors for millions who thought they had to choose between their minds and hearts, Jonathan said in one interview. He proved that the most intellectually honest position might actually be faith. The cultural impact rippled outward unexpectedly. Seminary professors assigned clips in apologetic courses. Atheist forums had more nuanced discussions about religious experience. Peterson's books surged in sales, but readers now saw his insights not as alternatives to faith but as descriptions of how divine truth operates in human consciousness. 3 months later, Peterson and Jonathan met privately for dinner. No cameras, no audience, just two men who'd become friends through a shared encounter with truth. Peterson later described it as one of the most peaceful evenings of his life. The remarkable thing, he told a friend, is that my intellect hasn't diminished. If anything, it's functioning more clearly now that it's aligned with truth rather than defending against it. I was so afraid that faith would diminish my reason. Instead, it's given my reason a firm foundation it never had. For you watching this story unfold, there's a question you can no longer avoid. Are you, like Peterson was, caught between what you know in your mind and what you sense in your soul? Have you built elaborate frameworks to avoid taking the one step that terrifies you most? The same truth that broke through Peterson's defenses is knocking at your door too. Not demanding you abandon reason, but inviting you to follow it all the way to its source. Jonathan's courage in sharing his experience was about bearing witness to what he'd encountered, trusting that truth has its own power to convince. And Peterson's courage in admitting what he truly believed wasn't weakness, it was the strongest thing he'd ever done. If this story has stirred something in you, if you felt that same tension between intellect and intuition, perhaps it's time to stop analyzing from a safe distance and step into the reality that's been calling you. The same God who met Jonathan at 2 a.m., who broke through Peterson's defenses on a television stage, is ready to meet you wherever you are. Not demanding perfection, not requiring all the answers, but simply inviting you to stop running from what you already know is true. Subscribe for more stories of how truth transforms lives. And in the comments, share your response. Are you still analyzing, or are you ready to believe? Because as both Peterson and Jonathan discovered, on the other side of that terrifying step isn't the loss of reason, it's the discovery of reality itself.